America's ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith, tells me that time is of the essence for getting weapons to Ukraine. Then
she talks about being a child of parents who grew up under Jim Crow, and I found that part so moving.
Harvard law professor Tomiko Brown-Nagin joins Michelle Martin with insight and reflections on the confirmation hearing of Supreme Court Justice nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson. And finally,
when I had my son, I decided, okay, to slow down. My priority is raising my children.
Superstar Spanish Best Actress nominee Penelope Cruz talks film and family ahead of this weekend's Oscars. Welcome to the program, everyone. I'm Christiana Manpour in London. President Joe Biden has ended this week of high-stakes unity and diplomacy near the Ukrainian border to signal continued allied resolve in this battle against Russian aggression. In Poland, the frontline NATO nation, the American leader met and thanked members of the 82nd Airborne Division. He sat with them and bonded over pizza. Biden also met with the Polish president, and before flying home, he'll see refugees and deliver a major address. Meanwhile, over in Moscow, President Putin, suffering severe setbacks on the battlefield and increasingly isolated, made this bizarre comparison that Russia is being cancelled just like Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling. The US and Europe are keeping the pressure on Putin. Before leaving for Poland, Biden and his counterpart at the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, announced a joint task force to wean Europe off its dependence on Russian oil and gas.
First, we're coming together to reduce Europe's dependence on Russian energy. Putin has issued Russia's energy resources to coerce and manipulate its neighbors. That's how he's used it. He's used the profits to drive his war machine.
Now, Christine Lagarde is president of the European Central Bank, and she's former managing director of the International Monetary Fund. She says the West's draconian sanctions are clipping the wings of Russia's central bank, and that Putin's attempt to get energy payments in rubles indicates the sanctions are really biting. In an exclusive interview, she warns also the costs to the European and global economy are rising. Christine Lagarde, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me, Christiane.
So a huge economic challenge now because of this war, and mostly because of the rise in energy prices because of Europe's dependence on Russian energy. What do you make of President Biden and the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, talking today about creating a new joint task force to reduce dependence on Russian energy? How will that affect the economy?
That rapprochement between the United States and Europe on the occasion of the Ukraine terrible war initiated by Russia is a blessing. I think it is incredibly important that the West, let's call it that way for short of a better word, is actually united, is joining forces, is together on a defense front, on an energy front, and in its absolute condemnation of what is happening in Ukraine at the moment. So this is really good news, and I'm very pleased that President Biden decided to come over for these meetings.
On the energy front, because it is driving your pain and the pain, you know, that all of you central bankers have to deal with on behalf of citizens all over the world, how long do you think, realistically, do you foresee, predict, energy independence from Russia? And what countries do you look at as stepping in to plug that gap?
You know, energy is a critically important factor in relation to prices. Our job as central bankers is to maintain price stability, is to watch inflation, is to make sure that it does not get de-anchored in terms of expectations. So energy, which plays such a critical part at the moment, needs our full attention. Some countries in Europe are 100% dependent, not many. Some are 40% dependent, some are 20% dependent on Russian supply of oil or gas or coal. The overall on average is 22%, but there is real diversity if you look at Bulgaria, 100%, Germany, depending on whether you talk oil or gas, but roughly 40%, a little less than that. Italy, a bit less, France and Spain, very little. So real diversity, but dependence on Russia is a critical nut to crack. And I think that we need not only to be united, we need to accelerate the move towards a green energy mix, which had been initiated, but which will be further accelerated. And we need to rely on friends and allies. I think that the alliance between the United States and Europe is important. I think the reaching out to countries like Algeria, great gas producer, to Qatar, huge gas producer as well, to various other Middle East producers is also going to be in the cards, because we want to sever the tie with Russian supply, if only to control prices and to make sure that we are not dependent.
You want to sever ties. Can I ask you about the outlook, the global story as you see it? Because clearly, you know, a month ago, before this invasion, there were great hopes that the global economy, let's just talk about the European economy specifically, because that's what you do, was on the way to growth out of the COVID disaster. And the COVID, I guess, was it a recession or certainly a crisis? Describe where you were and where you are now.
Well, we were on the cusp of the most spectacular recovery after the most brutal economic shock that we had seen in the century. Jobs were up, growth was up, incomes were up, inflation was up a little bit as well, and we were getting ready to normalize monetary policy. So it all looked really good, almost too good to be true. And then the war broke out. So those forces that were already out there, you know, high energy prices because the demand was strong and there was constrained supply, various bottlenecks that industrialists experienced, all that was amplified, aggravated, and to add to it, uncertainty clearly grew out of the war. And the element that we have no clue about, which is what is going to happen? How long will it take? When will people sit at the table to actually negotiate peace rather than fight and kill each other? So uncertainty is what has compounded everything else, which is leading us to keeping all options on the table, continuing the path that we had initiated, but certainly with more humility, more flexibility, and the certainty that we want to constantly revisit our projections and determine our monetary policy accordingly.
Christine Lagarde, one economic expert said that this war could be an even bigger shock to the global economy than the pandemic. I don't know whether you agree with that, but particularly, what does it mean for ordinary citizens? While you make your calculations and try to do things to mitigate this, what about ordinary citizens? We've heard the French foreign minister and others now worry about such massive food price rises. Apparently, the French president is talking about handing out food vouchers to French citizens. Over in much poorer countries, let's say in North Africa and around, there's worry that there could be skyrocketing basic supplies like bread and stuff, which could lead to instability and even famine, or at least severe hunger.
You're right, Christian. Because Russia and Ukraine are both huge producers of wheat in particular, and represent together about 30% of exports of wheat around the world, the war that is going on at the moment, particularly at the time of the planting of seeds, is going to create a massive disruption on markets. It has begun already. If you look at the price of wheat, it has gone up by about 40%. But there are countries that depend heavily on import of wheat. Look at a country like Egypt, for instance, 100 million people, and they depend heavily on the import of wheat. And there are other countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, that also are going to be affected significantly by the situation, which is why, the longer it lasts, the more harmful it will be and the more damage it's going to cause. It will be harmful for all those who have to pay an extra tax income squeeze because of energy prices. But it's going to be a lot worse for those people who simply will not have the food available to put on the table. So we need to find solutions that are going to work for all of us. And the best one would be for belligerents to sit at the table and to negotiate, because at the end of the day, this will happen anyway. So the sooner it does, the less people die, the less suffering there is in Ukraine, and the better for the whole economy.
So do you feel moved? Would you suggest, advise, or actually do any further stimulus for the European economy?
You know, fiscal remedies are needed. There is so much that monetary policy can do, and monetary policy will take its course, will normalize in the conditional fashion that we've identified, will be data dependent. But fiscal is going to have to play a role. Now, hopefully, fiscal authorities will tailor their fiscal support properly, and will really focus on those people most exposed, most vulnerable to the shock that we are suffering. So I know that for the moment there are some sort of pretty wide measures that are adopted, and that was probably the first response. But if this situation lasts, there will have to be some more targeting, more tailoring of the fiscal support that will be extended.
So some of the big CEOs in the economic and financial field, for instance, the asset manager Larry Fink of BlackRock has written that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has put an end to globalization that we've experienced over the last 3 decades. And we've seen Jamie Dimon of Morgan Stanley call for a Marshall Plan to resolve Europe and the world's energy crisis and energy problems and dependence on Russia. I spoke, as I said, to the president of the European Council, Charles Michel, just this week in Brussels, and he talked about sanctions that had to be sensible sanctions, intelligent ones. Let me just play for you what he said.
We are much more dependent in Europe in comparison with the situation in the United States. That's why we must be intelligent. The goal is to target Russia. The goal is to be painful against Russia. The goal is not to be painful for ourselves.
So from your perspective, are the sanctions right now intelligent ones? And do you think that, for instance, this really puts an end to globalization, as Larry Fink has said?
I think Larry is probably right to say that at this point in time, globalization as we know it will not continue. It will take a different form. I hope we're not going back to, let's do business behind our borders and have nothing to do with each other. Because a good, sensible globalization with respect, with level playing field, with good trade rules is something that can be extremely helpful. But it is going to be rethought through and, the sort of outsourcing, offshoring, without any consideration for friends or foes, as long as there was business to be had, I think that will probably be revisited, and it's probably for the better. On the other issue of sanctions, I would say that some of the sanctions have been extremely efficient. I would think of, the freezing of assets held by the National Central Bank of Russia has proven to be extremely efficient. Other sanctions will certainly be elaborated further, but I would add that it's not the people of Russia who have to be sanctioned. It's the regime of Russia. It's the decision makers of Russia who have to be really targeted at the most.
Finally, is there anything that I've missed from your perspective as the expert on predictions, on growth, on how much more pain is going to be inflicted on the global economies and therefore people? Or do you see an end to this and a get back to the success story which was happening just a month ago before the war?
There will be an end to this. How soon is a big question mark. What form will it take? Huge question mark. We will certainly see a very weakened Russia as a result of what has happened. And one thing that I'd like to add, Christiana, is that, in a very humble way, we're trying to help our Ukrainian friends and colleagues. And we are working on a scheme that hopefully will help Ukrainian refugees who are crossing the borders with plastic bag full of banknotes to convert those hryvnia into euros. We have a system in place. It's almost turnkey. It can operate on a pan-European basis. I hope it works. I hope it's picked up by the member states and by the Commission. If another system is in place, we'll be happy to also help with it. But it's so sad to see these millions of people coming across with mothers with children, grandparents with their pets, and not have the ability to spend a bit of the money that they came across with.
You know what? That's a great way to end. Very compassionate. ECB President Christine Lagarde, thank you so much for joining us. And let's hope that works. Now, the world watched in horror the bombing of the Mariupol theater, which had been a shelter. That happened some 10 days ago. And now, new video has emerged on social media showing people covered in dust making their escape on that terrible day. Officials in Mariupol now say that based on eyewitness reports, they believe about 600 people survived the attack. Tragically, though, they think 300 people were killed. When I spoke to the US ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith, at the Brussels summit, she told me this human suffering is what keeps NATO unified and resolved to support Ukraine. Ambassador Smith, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
An amazing summit, emergency summit, and President Biden says that NATO has never been and never demonstrated its unity and its strength as much as it is today. Do you agree, and how did that go down in the summit?
Well, the summit was extraordinary. I'm glad that we were able to lay on an in-person summit to bring all the leaders of the alliance together in this moment. It was important for a couple of reasons. I mean, obviously, the leaders wanted to get together and send a strong signal back to Moscow about alliance unity and resolve. But it was also a message to our own publics about what NATO is doing in this moment. And most importantly, it was a signal to Ukraine about our ongoing determination to continue to support the people of Ukraine.
The president of Ukraine did address it, the summit, your summit. I mean, it was behind closed doors. We understand, because I think he put it out on his Facebook, that he didn't do his usual ask for a no-fly zone and the like, but he did ask for other things. And he also said, you know, we have shown that in 1 month of resisting the third biggest army in the world, we are NATO ready. How did you take what he was saying?
I thought it was a really interesting argument. He's right, of course, and we've known that for a long time, that the Ukrainian military forces are superb. And in fact, as a partner to NATO, we've seen their performance. We've been able to exercise and train together for quite some time. We've all been impressed with Ukrainian forces, but that changed dramatically in terms of being even more impressed, obviously, since Russia went into Ukraine. Their fighting spirit, their capability, their determination, it's been remarkable and really something to watch. And in terms of what President Zelensky actually asked for, this is really part of an ongoing conversation that we've been having with Ukraine for many, many weeks now, and that is that they come to the alliance and tell us what more they need in terms of air defense capabilities or anything they believe they need to defend themselves. So this is an ongoing conversation. It was important for him to continue to relay those ideas, and we'll continue to take those suggestions and asks and match them with allied nations.
Do you feel a sense of having to rush to actually get all the defensive weapons that they require in a timely manner? And are you confident that these weapons that are going in are doing so, you know, in time in order to be able to keep staving off the Russian advances?
There's no doubt that time is of the essence, and we want to make sure that any country that comes forward and pledges military assistance is actually going to deliver it in short order, and the alliance has been working to make sure that's the case. In terms of the timing of deliverables, all I can actually comment on is the United States, where we have taken a look at the deliverable, like the timelines of how capabilities are moving into Ukraine. And from what we can tell so far, those capabilities that the U.S. is providing, over $2 billion of support and lethal assistance so far, they actually are making their way into Ukraine and getting into the hands of the Ukrainian forces.
So here we are at the end of the week. President Biden is visiting Poland. Obviously, Poland plays a massive strategic and humanitarian part in this crisis. I believe the president announced a whole load of humanitarian aid for Ukrainian refugees. What can you tell us about Poland and how they're doing on the refugee front?
Well, this situation, what Poland is going through, is really putting a strain on this country. But what has been so impressive is to watch the Polish people welcome Ukrainian refugees into their homes with open arms. Poland is not the only country under strain feeling this right there on the border. There are others, the Baltic states, Romania, many other countries on NATO's eastern flank are stepping up, but feeling this, feeling these refugees coming in. And it is difficult to absorb millions of Ukrainians each and every day. So we've been incredibly impressed. It's why the president wanted to go to Poland, to send a signal to the Polish people, but also the Ukrainians that are arriving there each and every week.
Do you think 100,000 that the U.S. says it's going to take in is enough?
It's a great start. Let's start there. I'm very excited to see the president make this announcement, and I think it's the right thing to be doing right now, and we'll take it day by day.
You think there should be more?
I have no idea. We'll have to assess it in real time.
Because the rest of Europe, much less able than you, is taking millions.
True, there are millions of Ukrainians moving across the border into many countries in Europe, but I think what's great right now is that the alliance has come together to express a willingness to help all of those refugees.
One more question about Poland, since the president is there. He'll be meeting with the president of Poland as well. We know that the government is led by a very conservative and somewhat, it's described as an illiberal Democrat. It's not necessarily the most forward-leaning in terms of democracy and rule of law. It's challenging the EU. It has been fined by the EU for all sorts of reasons. We're in a different situation right now. But is that part of the president's calculation as well? Because, of course, he started his administration with wanting to have a democracy summit and really trying to put democracy ahead of autocracy.
Well, here's the great thing about the NATO alliance. First and foremost, we can focus on the crisis at hand, and we are. And the emergency summit that took place this week is a strong symbol of that. But what's also great is that the allies can come together on a regular basis and debate and have differences over either specific NATO policies or what's happening in our national capitals. And we do that every week here at NATO. So I think this is an alliance that's healthy. It's open to these types of debates. We will, on occasion, raise challenges to other NATO allies when we believe we have issues to discuss. But right now, let me be clear, the focus is on this war in Ukraine and making it stop.
Part of that is economic, obviously, with the sanctions. There were some new sanctions announced, but there's also appears to be, and maybe you can confirm, cracks in the resolve amongst Europeans for sanctions, particularly energy ones, particularly the Netherlands and Germany?
Well, every ally that comes to the table, whether it's through the EU-US relationship to talk about sanctions or here at NATO headquarters, we all bring different perspectives, history, culture to the table. And so, of course, there are differences. There have been differences from day one about how we approach this conflict and what steps we're each willing to take. But again, back to your original message, the president was right when he said this is an incredible moment for the alliance. The level of unity that you're seeing stemming from Brussels across the Atlantic is really something to behold. And it's, I think, a strong signal back to Russia that their attempts to divide us are in essence failing. So I feel very good about where alliance unity is right now.
Putin apparently appears to be trying to troll you all. He sent out some directive that there would be no more energy transactions unless you all paid in rubles. That's obviously to help him, given the sanctions and the restriction to dollars and the rest. Is that even a starter for you?
I don't know if that's on the table. It's hard to imagine. We don't focus on those types of issues here at NATO HQ. But again, I think what this tells us is that Moscow is really feeling this moment, really feeling the pressure that the transatlantic partners are applying on Moscow. And I think he understands fundamentally that his forces are not performing as they anticipated. He's not achieving his objectives, either in Ukraine or in regards to the transatlantic partners. So you hear these statements that he's making, but to me, they feel a bit desperate, to be honest.
A bit desperate for everybody would be the use of WMD. President Biden has said that, intelligence shows that maybe the more desperate they get on the battlefield, the more they will potentially lash out with chemical or biological weapons. I spoke to the Kremlin spokesman, close confidant of President Putin, who would not rule out the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. How are you factoring that in, and how is that playing into your decisions about how you move forward with this particular crisis and trying to help Ukraine?
So our strategy before Russia went into Ukraine was really to prepare for all contingencies. So we were simultaneously trying to prepare for some sort of de-escalation and urging the Russians to take the off-ramp, which sadly Putin did not. But we were preparing simultaneously to reinforce NATO's eastern flank, and we had the plans in place to do that the minute Russia went into Ukraine, and that's why you saw the speed with which we were able to respond. Similarly, now we're preparing for alternative scenarios. The alliance is sitting down and thinking about what would it need to do or be prepared to do in the wake of one of these darker scenarios, the use of chemical weapons as he has used in the past, or the use of tactical nuclear weapons, which is horrifying to even imagine. But at this point, what's happening in this alliance is a lot of very important work to think through the steps that we would need to take. And part of what you heard this week at the NATO summit was a focus by the alliance on CBRN measures in chemical and biological and radiological weapons, what NATO forces could do to support NATO allies or Ukraine in the wake of that type of attack.
So I hate to use red lines for obvious reasons, but the president also said that if there was any perception or fact of this kind of use, that there will be heavy consequences for Russia. What is your line in the sand?
Well, it's hard to get into hypotheticals, but I think, again, that comes back to what we're doing, and that's why this meeting in Brussels is so important this week, because the leaders needed to come together at 30 and start talking through some of these scenarios and think through what do the words serious consequences actually mean? And those are the types of consequences or conversations that are ongoing behind closed doors.
These are very difficult times. I wonder if you would just reflect on Madeleine Albright, who died this week, and obviously was a bit of a mentor and an example to you, given your experience in the Foreign Service and the State Department.
Well, it's so funny. I think of her so often when I'm here at NATO, everything that she spent her life on, fighting for democracy. She was really, for me, such a symbol of everything that the transatlantic relationship represents. She taught me so much. She was a personal mentor of mine. Really, my heart aches, and she will be missed. The bright spot is that she spent so much of her career mentoring and training the next generation, particularly women, but also men, of national security experts, and we all count our lucky stars that we had a chance to spend time with her. She will definitely be missed.
Ambassador Julianne Smith, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Albright was a trailblazer, and we turn to another one now, to the U.S. Supreme Court confirmation hearing for Ketanji Brown Jackson, who has kept her composure in the face of what even some conservative critics have called meritless questioning. Our next guest is Tomiko Brown Nagin, an award-winning legal historian and dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Her latest book, Civil Rights Queen, recognizes the path paved by one of Brown's idols, Constance Baker Motley, and she joins Michelle Martin to discuss then and now.
Thanks, Christian. Dean Tomiko Brown Nagin, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be with you.
You're a dean of a graduate division at Harvard University. You're a professor of law and a professor of history. So I'm just wondering, I'm guessing that in that capacity, you interact with a lot of students. Do you have a sense of what this nomination means to them, particularly young women interested in careers in the law?
You know, every Supreme Court nomination process, the hearings are always appointment TV for law students and for students more broadly who are interested in the law, and never more so than with these hearings. Judge Jackson is inspiring. As she herself noted, she has been receiving lots of letters from young girls who are looking to her and having their sense of what they can do in the world expanded. And I just think that's just great. It is a teaching moment for this country. The very fact of this woman who is visibly diverse, an African-American woman, sitting there at the table and answering questions from these senators, only one of whom is African-American, was just tremendous. It is a testament to progress in this country, although other aspects of the hearing were testaments to how far we still have to go.
You're a legal historian, and I want to just read a little bit from a tribute to Justice Thurgood Marshall, who's the first African-American to serve on the Supreme Court. This is from Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court. And she talked about listening to Justice Marshall talk eloquently to the media about the social stigmas and lost opportunities uttered by African-American children in state-imposed segregated schools. My awareness of race-based disparities deepened. I could not know it then, but the man who would, as a lawyer and jurist, captivate the nation would also, as a colleague and friend, profoundly influenced me. What qualities do you feel Judge Brown Jackson will bring to the court that could be potentially reformative for the court and perhaps for the justices themselves?
I think her greatest asset lies in her experience with the criminal legal system, both as the niece of an individual who was incarcerated, as a lawyer for criminal defendants, as a U.S. District Court judge, where in that capacity, she has seen every type of American. That is the beauty of the federal judicial system, the trial court, which I had the opportunity to clerk on. It's just an amazing place. And in that role, she will have seen everyone, and she will have had deep and personal experiences with them that I think are vital to informing the conversations that are had among the justices about the various criminal law issues that arise. And there are quite a few. And it's particularly important in this moment of what we're calling racial reckoning for there to be a justice who has those experiences. I also think it's important, Michelle, that she grew up in Miami, which is, of course, a gateway to Latin America. We've never had a Supreme Court justice who had that kind of variety and diversity in her racial experience. She talks about being a child of parents who grew up under Jim Crow, and I found that part so moving. We share that history. And so she's one generation removed from Thurgood Marshall's experience, and I have every sense that she will make a tremendous contribution to the type of conversations that are had at the Supreme Court and in many ways raise the level.
You wrote for Slate in an article about the fact that critics have seized on her 2-year stint as a public defender to portray her as a pawn of the imagined radical left. What do you make of that? She would be the first public defender to sit on the high court. And what do you make of the fact that, at least in the run-up to these hearings, this is the very thing that critics sort of pounced on her about?
It's exceedingly curious, Michelle, and perhaps suggests that even those who tend to portray themselves as patriotic and as lovers of the Constitution may not truly understand what it means. The Sixth Amendment confers a right to counsel. It's a part of the Bill of Rights, an extraordinarily important part of our constitutional system. The Supreme Court itself held many years ago that indigent criminal defendants are entitled to have counsel appointed when they can't afford it themselves. And that's because the entire judicial system depends on when the government charges a person with the crime, that individual having the right and the ability to effectively respond. The integrity of our legal system depends on public defenders participating in it.
What do you make of the confirmation process overall. I mean, I don't know if you would use this word, just some of the questions seemed outright bizarre. I mean, clearly some of them were hostile. This is Senator Ted Cruz questioning her about the influence of critical race theory on children. I'll just play that.
There are portions of this book that I find really quite remarkable. One portion of the book says babies are taught to be racist or anti-racist. There is no neutrality. Another portion of the book, they recommend to babies confess when being racist. Now, this is a book that is taught at Georgetown Day School to students in pre-K through second grade, so 4 through 7 years old. Do you agree with this book that is being taught with kids that babies are racist?
Senator, I do not believe that any child should be made to feel as though they are racist or though they are not valued or though they are less than, that they are victims, that they are oppressors. I don't believe in any of that.
I don't know. What do you make of it?
I thought the hearings were disappointing and largely a missed opportunity to talk about the law, the wide range of subject areas that might come before Judge Jackson or that she should be conversant in as a nominee to the Supreme Court. It devolved into basically pure politics, with Judge Jackson being asked any number of policy questions that she shouldn't have had to answer, including things like whether there should be more or fewer police officers and questions about average sentences for murderers, a lot of foregrounding of issues of crime. The whole foray into critical race theory, racist babies, and of course the fixation on child pornography. Now, let me say this, Michelle, the senators were certainly within their rights to ask about Judge Jackson's sentences, including because she has a background in sentencing policy, having served on the U.S. Sentencing Commission. And yet it did become clear that there was an agenda to just focus on child pornography. And of course, there's a wider a background to this where there are groups that evidently are fringe groups that are focused on this issue. And so it really was to a large extent, a circumstance where the senators were, some of the senators, I should say, were using the hearing as an opportunity to appeal to their constituencies, to draw distinctions between themselves and the Democratic Party. And Judge Jackson was just along for the ride. And many times, the senators wouldn't even let her speak. They kept interrupting her. And so it was clear that they really didn't want the answers. They just wanted to focus on their agendas. And it was sad and disappointing.
So let's go back into history a bit. In his speech at the White House after accepting President Biden's nomination, Judge Brown Jackson expressed gratitude for Constance Bacon Motley, the first woman to serve as a federal judge, whom she called an inspiration. And Dean Brown-Nagin, in remarkable timing, you just published a biography about Judge Motley's life. I'm just wondering why you took her on, and tell us a little bit about her.
As I said in the introduction to the book, Michelle, I wanted to write the story of her life, first of all, because she's fascinating. She had a tremendous impact in 3 different phases of a career. First, as a civil rights lawyer for 20 years with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, working alongside Thurgood Marshall, then as a New York politician, and finally as the first Black woman appointed to the federal judiciary. And I think that we don't know, many people don't know as much as they should about Motley, because the way in which history, like society generally, is gendered. So the figures who are considered worthy of our historical memory tend to be men, and that is true even in the civil rights historiography. And I thought that it's a kind of historical malpractice not to know about Constance Baker Motley, and I was happy to spend so much time writing this book about her life and legacy, including because she's so relevant still, and many of the issues that she played a role in as a lawyer and a judge are still relevant to our time.
You noted in the book about how often there was an attempt, but first she was an object of fascination, but by, you know, people would come to court just to stare at her, basically, because she was such a novelty, especially in those early days when she's arguing these, she's taking these, you know, very difficult civil rights cases in often very hostile environments, often very hostile Southern courts. And then, of course, again, her advocacy came up again when she was nominated to the bench. Do you see parallels to the current moment, even though the circumstances seem very different?
I do see, as I mentioned, progress. After all, it's because in part of Constance Baker Motley and Thurgood Marshall that Judge Jackson was able to attend integrated schools and to become a nominee who has such eminent qualifications that this hasn't been a focus of discussion. At the same time, I certainly see parallels in the way that some have sought to use what is Judge Jackson's greatest asset, her practice background, against her in the very same way that Constance Baker Motley's practice background and civil rights, including on behalf of criminal defendants, was used against her. There were those who said she should not be appointed to the federal judiciary because she had spent a career representing plaintiffs in civil rights cases, that somehow she couldn't be fair because of that, which of